Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. My name is Professor Puleng Sekgalo, and today we're going to be focusing on argumentative and debative academic writing. So it's a blast session, and so I'm going to be focusing on some of the things that you need to think about when formulating an argument, and as it's important when you are working on your research, so that the reader can be able to see the thread in terms of what idea you've put forward and how you are then going on to make sure that we can be able to follow the logic of what you're saying in the research that you're doing. I hope all your studies are going well thus far. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to switch off my camera and then I'm going to share my presentation and then we will continue. Okay, great. So as I indicated, today we are focusing on the art of argumentation, argumentative and debative academic writing. Those of you who know about debating will already have an idea of what is required when one is debating, right? So the idea is that you have a particular point, a particular idea, and you want to convince your listener or you want to convince your reader about the point that you're making, but you need to have supporting facts and sources, in this case, when you're writing the references as well, that are going to support the claim that you're making. Okay, so how do we do this within the academic writing space? Okay, if I can get my presentation to move. Okay, there we go. So what is argumentation? Argumentation is communicative reason. It's the way in which we communicate in situations where your sole purpose is to prove something to the person who is reading your work. And you do this through providing justification for the claim that you're making, through the beliefs that are there, that exist, the attitudes and the values. And based on those, you formulate a particular value or a particular argument, right? It is the process of forming reasons. This is the reason why I'm making this argument. This is the reason why I'm putting this claim forward. And based on this, these are the conclusions that we can then come to, right? And at the end of the day, it's so that the person who's reading what you're writing can then be influenced or can then be convinced of the claim that you're making. So what is it that needs to be in place? What is it that you need to do? What are the processes that you need to follow to ensure that the reader is convinced of the argument that you are making, right? So what is an argument? An argument takes a stand on a particular issue. So in this case, think about your own research topic. So what is the issue that you are researching? What is the issue that you are interested in, the questions that you have? And what is it that you're hoping to achieve? What is it that you're hoping the reader is going to take with them when they're done reading your work? And at the end, so whether you're going to have 5 chapters, 6 chapters, 7 chapters, at the end of your work, what you are seeking to do is that you want your reader to be persuaded, right? You want to have your reader persuaded that yes, indeed, A causes B, that indeed such issues or such experiences can be understood in this particular way. And when we get to this understanding, then we can be able to take step 1, 2, and 3, right? And a good example or an easy example that we can think of is when you're thinking about a courtroom. In a courtroom, there are two opposing sides, right? There are those who are for the defendant and those who are against the defendant. And so this is what lawyers do. So you argue a particular case. So when you think about your own research, your own thesis or dissertation, you need to think about it in that way. And that can then assist you to say, but if I'm putting a case forward, if I'm putting an argument forward, saying that this person is guilty, I'm saying they're guilty based on these reasons, right? This is the evidence that I have, that the person was caught red-handed, the person was there at the scene, and they were not only at the scene, but this is what they had with them, and therefore this is the reason why I'm saying this person is guilty. So you need to provide evidence, right? So within academic writing, it's also important for you to provide this evidence. And this is how you then build up your argument. And then the same on the other side as well. So how do you make an argument in a way that is not going to be easily refutable by another person, right? So it's not just a description or a summary of what happened. This person is guilty because on this date and that date they were there. So you're providing a summary of what happened on a particular day. And that's not how you formulate an argument. And I like this example that I found online because I thought it's so apt. So this is an argument, right? This paper, in this thesis, I'm going to argue that the movie JFK is inaccurate in its portrayal of President Kennedy. So that's an argument that you're making. That's what you're putting forward, right? And on the other hand, a summary is not an argument. If you say in this paper, I will describe the portrayal of President Kennedy that is shown in the movie JFK. That is not an argument. That is just a statement. You're describing, this is what the movie is, this is what the movie is about, this is what happens in the movie. But when you critically engage with that movie, then you focus on particular issues, particular aspects of the movie to then negate certain things, to then argue certain things. So now here your argument says there is inaccuracies in the movie, right? So that's the argument that you're making. So what is the next step that you're going to take? The next step is now for you to convince me, your reader, what these inaccuracies are and why they are inaccuracies, right? So this is now the step that you're going to take. These are the things, there are things that you're going to then be putting in place that are going to show these inaccuracies, that are going to show how these accuracies are coming forward and why these inaccuracies therefore make the movie to not be a good movie, or make the movie to not be a true portrayal of the life of President Kennedy, right? So that's what an argument is. And then on the other hand, again, in addition to an argument, you need to build a thesis, right? So what is your broad thesis based on this argument, right? This movie is inaccurate in its portrayal, and therefore this is what, and it's so in these particular ways, right? A thesis statement is a sentence that you state. It states an argument about a topic, and then you describe briefly how you will prove your argument. So you state your argument, and then in addition to stating your argument, you then indicate how you're going to prove this argument. And then that statement, that's your thesis statement, right? And again, continuing with the example that we were just focusing on right now, the movie JF Kennedy inaccurately portrays President Kennedy, right? So that's your argument. And then the thesis, therefore, then based on this argument, is that this movie inaccurately portrays President Kennedy because of the way it ignores his youth, his relationship with his father, for example, and the findings of the Warren Commission. Right, so these are the inaccuracies, that you cannot speak about this person and say the movie is about this person, and not being specific about particular issues that the movie covers. So if you just say the movie's about this person, and then when a person watches the movie, there are certain aspects of that person's lives that have not critical, what you deem as critical aspects of that person's life, then therefore you argue that there are inaccuracies, right? And now you go on to say, this is how I'm going to show what the inaccuracies are. And then after showing what the inaccuracies are, then I'm going to go ahead and show why it's important to include these things, right? Why is the relationship with his father important? Why is us knowing about his youth important, right? What is the central issue around the Warren Commission? Why is that commission important as an integral part of us understanding his life, right? And so these are the three aspects that you then choose to focus on for your thesis. So it could be that there are other aspects like maybe marriage, children, and things like that. But you have chosen that for your thesis, these are the issues that you're going to be focusing on as inaccuracies that you want to highlight in your argument, right? So a thesis makes a specific statement, as we've just seen now. This particular statement is what then is going to drive you, to assist you to then go on with the work that you're going to be doing, right? And then that's also going to determine how you're going to be collecting your data and where particularly your data could possibly come from, based on what you said the focus is going to be, based on the thesis statement that you've put forward, right? So it's a statement about what you're going, you'll be trying to argue here and claiming, and then you then going to do the work of convincing your reader on why these things are important to include if one thinks about putting together a movie, because doing so is going to then assist us to have an accurate portrayal, right? And a thesis should not be too long, because in that way you can easily confuse yourself, you can easily get lost, all right? So you always need to think about, how can I simply and clearly state my argument? How can I simply and clearly state my thesis statement? Because the clearer your argument or your thesis is, the easier, the better for you to be able to, that you're going to be focused, right? It assists you also to narrow down what you want to do so that you don't confuse yourself, but also to know exactly and specifically what the next steps would be and how you're going to go on with the next steps, right? So you can have it as the statement, you can have it as a paragraph where you then, in addition to indicating this statement, then you provide a follow-up statement that is in line with the main statement of the thesis that you've put together. All right. Now, going back to that example of the lawyer, right? An argument, the central point, the claim that you're making, every thesis deserves its day in court. So you, as the author, as the writer, you as the one who's come up with this topic, who's interested in this particular topic, who's invested in this topic, you are the one who can advocate for this thesis, right? For this topic. So you work with your supervisor, and that's your starting point, to be able to say, these are the ideas that I have. This is the claim that I want to make. And this is why I think it's important for us to explore and engage with this argument that I'm putting forward. So you can put a thesis forward, you can put an argument forward, but if you are unable to then provide evidence, if you are unable to prove that this person, if we go back to the court case, this person is guilty, then you leave the judge or the magistrate with no option but to actually find the person not guilty or to throw the case out. So it's important for you to convince me, right? And you can only do that if you are able to support the claim that you're making, right? So the jury, in this case, your reader, the first being your supervisor, and if you're lucky enough to have a critical reader, maybe your critical reader as well, expects you to provide evidence, expects you to say, okay, this is the argument that you're making, fine. But why are you making this argument? Why should I go with the argument that you're making? Why should I believe this argument? So to prove the thesis statement on historical topics, for example, what kind of evidence can one use? Right. So if it's a historical issue, for example, if it's the life of someone like JFK, who is a character in the history of the United States. So what are some of the places you can go to? Where can you go to draw the evidence that you need for the work that you're doing? So if you are writing your thesis and your focus is the life of JFK as portrayed in a movie, and the interest in looking at how the movie does not accurately portray his life, where do I go to get evidence for this claim that I'm making, right? So you can look at the letters. Are there any letters that are available that I can look at that can assist me to get this information that I want? Personal diaries or work diaries that are there that I can draw from, that maybe from the content I can be able to get the evidence that I require, right? Government documents. So if maybe you are a student in history, for example, and you're interested in historical issues, and the life of a historical figure is portrayed, and as a scholar, as an academic, you're interested in ensuring that the ways in which things are portrayed show accuracies in terms of the information that is given, because it assists in the kind of narrative that people will then understand, right? And then the narrative that people will have. So what government documents are there, for example? If it's something in line with like the commission, for example, and that was an integral part of what that historical figure was involved in, were the meetings that were held. Those can be sources that one could draw from, right? Newspapers, interviews. So these are all different kinds of sources that you could use. So both secondary and primary data, interviews, who would need to be interviewed for you to be able to get the kind of data that's going to assist you to be able to support the claim that you're making in your argument. What articles are relevant for this? What books are there that can assist you to explain and interpret this historical event or person that you are writing about? Are there other films, for example, that have focused on this person's life? And in what way are those films portraying that person's life? What are they focusing on? So how do you then bring that into your own study, into the argument that you're making, as a way to try and show that based on this evidence, I can make this particular claim, right? And how do you then use this evidence, right? You can use examples again as data that come from some of these sources. So I've indicated many possible sources that you can think about, right? Letters, diaries, interviews, articles. What is it that would be useful for you? What is it that you think, if you draw from this, would be useful for you? And this again is going to be linked to the objective that you want to reach. This will be linked to the question that you're going to ask, because then that will also assist you in terms of thinking about what is the best way for me to collect data so that I'm able to answer my research question, but also so that I'm able to provide evidence for the argument that I've put forward, right? So use the evidence that you believe is credible, right? So if you go to newspapers, and these days we have a lot of social media spaces as well that people just share information, share knowledge. So it is your responsibility that as you're thinking about ways in which you can provide or prove your argument, you use sources that are credible. This is something that I'm sure you've heard before. This is something that I'm sure has come up in the conversation that you've had with your supervisors, the importance of credible evidence. So you're not just going to get evidence because it supports the claim that you've made, but it's important to also interrogate and engage with that evidence that is in front of you, right? So as I said, going through the different kinds of sources that are there, sifting through all of them, what articles are you going to include, what are you not going to include, and it has to be fair and clear. So again, when looking at the sources, you're not only going to use sources that support what you're saying only, even though it's problematic, but also look at what others have said that might not necessarily be in line with what you put forward, and then put those in conversation with each other, right? And that's good scholarship. Scholarship means you don't only look at and focus on things that just support what you're saying. That is good, but is that the only thing that is available, right? Is that the only thing that exists? And if there's other kinds of sources or data that is available, it's also important for you to engage with that as well. Okay. So that's also very, very important. As I said, be sure to identify the biases and shortcomings of each piece of evidence for your reader, right? And you use the evidence so that you try and avoid generalizations, right? So here's an example. If you make an assertion that all women have been oppressed, right? We know that in many spheres of society, in many parts of the world, women are oppressed, right? But if you say all women have been oppressed, is that a fair judgment? Is that a fair statement? Is that a legitimate generalization? Can you prove that all women have been oppressed, right? So what evidence can you use to support this? What is there, what's available that makes you then make the claim that all women have been oppressed, right? So when you check sources, when you look at other people's work, when you draw from the evidence that exists, that helps you to avoid and to check overgeneralization, because I think would all agree, and many people would agree that indeed women tend to be oppressed a lot, but can we overgeneralize? Is saying all women have been oppressed an overgeneralization? And maybe it's not, right? But then it's your job as the person who's writing a thesis or a dissertation to then prove to me that all women have been oppressed, right? So, and can you provide that evidence? And if you're unable to provide that evidence, then you cannot make such a claim, right? Use evidence, as I've indicated, to address opposing points of views. How do your sources give examples that refute another researcher's interpretation? Remember, as researchers, as scholars, we are in the space where we center knowledge production. You are doing your master's, you are doing your PhD because you want to, among other things, you want to contribute to the body of knowledge, right? You want to contribute towards the advancement of your field. And for you to be able to do that, you need to know what other scholars in your field, and in particular, what other scholars in that particular research focus area that you're working on have said, what they've researched, what they've come up with. And the beauty of knowledge production is that as things change and as we move forward, we continue to have more questions. We continue to have renewed understanding of things. We continue to have different ways of understanding reality because of how reality around us also changes as well. And that's why we have scholars, and we have scholarship, and we have knowledge production. And what that then means is that you may have a researcher who's written on a particular issue in 2010, right? And then someone comes in 2015 and says, but what that author said in 2010 is problematic in these particular ways. While perhaps in 2010, this was the issue. At the moment, the issue is different, and therefore that 2010 publication is not so relevant, and it requires building on, right? So while there might be things that might be useful, it's insufficient because it does not assist us to understand the reality or this particular issue as it presents itself today, right? And so when you come in as the researcher and you make an argument and you say you also acknowledge and understand that maybe others have also engaged with this issue, this is how they've looked at it. And this is why you're making this claim that all women have been oppressed, right? There's been scholars, there's been researchers who've looked at this issue, and they focused on particular areas or focused on particular experiences of women. And therefore, what they did was not all-encompassing. And so you're taking all of this into consideration, and having done that, you are therefore making the claim that all women have been oppressed. And now you're going to do the work of providing the evidence. And you do this by also acknowledging other work that have focused on this field, right? So that you are able to come to a conclusion that can convince us as the reader of the argument that you're making, right? That argument that you started with in your chapter 1, that you then build on in terms of looking at the literature that engages with this work, and then go on to look at the possible evidence that you can use to say, this is why your argument is valid, right? And the most important voice to get across is in your writing is your own. I've indicated the importance of acknowledging earlier work, the importance of acknowledging work that already exists, but you should not do this at the expense of silencing yourself. Because at the end of the day, when you're writing a thesis or a dissertation, you're doing so that you can be able to contribute to the field. And you will not be able to contribute to the field if your voice is not audible, right? If when you're writing, you're mostly relying on what others are saying or on what others have done. So what is your interpretation that you're bringing in to the conversation so that we can take something from what you're bringing in? What is it that you are contributing towards the advancement of a field, right? So you're showing me as a supervisor your thinking. You're showing me as a supervisor where you're going with the argument that you've put forward, right? What are your views, right? And how have you critically engaged with the topic that is being discussed, with the topic that you've chosen, right? So all women have been oppressed. So why have all women been oppressed, or why are you saying all women have been oppressed, right? So how are you then critically engaging with this topic? What is it that you're adding to the conversation around issues of women oppression, right? And you can do this by building an effective but also persuasive argument for your reader. What are the implications of women being oppressed? What are the signs? What are the things that are in place that shows us this connection, that shows us that actually all women have been oppressed? And this shows itself or manifests itself in the particular experiences that women have had, right? That no woman was allowed to vote, for example. So at some point, at a particular point in time, all women were oppressed because all women were not allowed to vote. So is that then the persuasion that you're bringing in to say, actually, my statement is valid? All women have been oppressed. And I'm saying this on the basis that women were not allowed to vote, and therefore that denied them a voice in terms of the decisions that were taken on their behalf, their decisions about their lives, their decisions about their families, their decisions about their communities, their decisions about their countries. And so they existed within these spaces that they did not have a say in, right? And so based on these, I therefore make this claim that women have been oppressed. And I'm providing this evidence going back, saying that these are the factual things. If you remember going back to the first slide, these are the facts that I'm putting forward to then say, based on these facts, my argument is valid, right? All right. And so here are some of the ways that you can establish your voice in your writing, right? Make your unattributed or not referenced assertion at the start of paragraphs. And this can then be followed by evidence or findings or arguments from your sources, right? So one of the things that you really must try to avoid, right? And at some point, somewhere in your work, you can do that. And you can do that because you want to connect it to something else, right? But as much as possible, provide your reader with an opening statement, right? An opening sentence. So provide a sentence that you will then go on to build on that claim that you're making in that statement. So think of how you put together your paragraphs. So each and every paragraph, you have different sections in your work. So you have your heading, you have sections under each and every heading. So if you have a particular heading, right, historical perspectives on women oppression, then it means under that heading, whether it's 3 or 5 paragraphs, all those paragraphs have to be related to that topic. They have to be speaking in different ways around historical perspectives on women oppression, right? So that's what those 5 topics or 5 paragraphs are about. But within these different paragraphs, so each and every paragraph will have an opening statement, right? And then there are sentences that follow. So it could be 3, 4, or 5 sentences that follow from the opening. And all these sentences have to follow from that assertion that you have made with the first sentence, right? So you need to always think very seriously about your opening sentence, your opening statement, because from there, everything that comes in that paragraph has to speak to that sentence, it has to be linked to that sentence. And this is what we mean when we're talking about the flow, right? So there has to be a flow in your narrative. There has to be a flow where one sentence leads to the next. And this is something that is often an issue in many of the writings that we get, where we get a draft from a student, and thinking about academic writing, that sometimes you find that there are actually 5 issues that you're talking about all in one paragraph. And that makes it very difficult to follow the logic of what you're saying. And so that's why, so think of that first paragraph, for example, as your thesis statement, right? So it's a statement that you put forward, and then you go on and follow with justification, with sources, with follow-up sentences that are connected to that initial argument, right? So here's an example of how you can open, right? To date, there is no well-established tool to measure divided attention in children, right? So that's your opening statement. So that's the assertion that you're making. You're saying there's no well-established tool to measure children's divided attention. Okay. And so current methods that are used to assess divided attention usually involve a variation of processes with an additional task, for example, counting or listening to auditory stimuli. And now this is the source. This is where you are supporting, right? You are supporting the statement that you've put forward, that there's no well-established tool, that there are current methods, right? So you are acknowledging what exists, you are acknowledging what is there, that there are some methods that are in place, but there still isn't no well-established tool, right? And the ones that exist focus on particular things and not an overall tool that assists us to measure divided attention in children. So those that exist focus on particular things, for example, counting or listening or auditory stimuli. So it's all these different things. So there are these methods, but then they're not all encompassing, right? And so that is why, therefore, you are thinking about the possibility of a tool that can assist to measure divided attention in children, right? So you've now said Salthouse said this. This is the current methods that are there. And how do you then, going back to how do you connect your sentences from one sentence to the next and to the next? So this is what Salthouse says. So are you going to then say something about what Salthouse says, or are you going to connect Salthouse with other authors who've also engaged with work around divided attention in children, right? So explicitly tell your reader what the connections are between sources. So you've spoken about Salthouse, and then you say, while Salthouse says there are some current methods, Smith, on the other hand, takes a different approach, right? So already then you're moving on to a third sentence in your paragraph, right? So you have that opening, and then you said there are these current methods, and some of them are these methods, as we can see from Salthouse, who's done this work focusing on these. However, Smith also has done this work, but takes a different approach, right? So you're showing what the connections are. You're showing where the researchers, depart and part ways in terms of the ways in which they approach this particular issue, right? So what are the connections to your main assertion, your main argument, and what are the things that also don't connect? So use language to show your strong agreement or disagreement, or being cautious with the agreement, right? So while I agree with what Smith claims in terms of the processes we can follow, I also, this does not wholly assist us to imagine the possibility of a tool that can be all-encompassing, right? So there you're not saying what Smith is saying, no, I don't agree with it. What Smith is saying is not going to assist me. You're saying I acknowledge what Smith has done, right? So, but I do so cautiously, because I think it still does not fully answer the question that I have. And therefore, there's still a need for us to dig deeper. There's still a need for us to continue on this, to look at ways in which we can get to a point where we have a well-established tool for measuring divided attention in children, because that's the end product. That's what you want to get at the end of the day. And you've made this claim and you've shown that, yes, there are people who've kind of looked at this work, but I find that there's still a gap. And so I'm going to do this work to find a way to fill these gaps, or this gap that I've identified, right? So that's how you build on your argument. And also that's how you establish your own voice as well, right? Because already the first line, that you've inserted your voice and you're saying these others are just there to accompany me so that I am able to show you, the reader, why actually this is important, right? So how do we then formulate an argument? And here I would like each one of you to think about your own research as I'm going through this, all right? An argument is the key point of any persuasive essay or speech or thesis, what you're writing. It's the part where the actual persuasion gets done, right? And as I've said, if we go back, so you're saying to date, there's no well-established tool to measure divided attention in children, right? So that's the argument that you're making, right? And then this argument is therefore supported and being given weight by showing what exists, what is there. So now you're persuading me that actually, okay, indeed, it's important for us to look at this issue. It's important for us to have this topic as worthy of doing research on, all right? So again, the way in which we use language is very important. How we make claims and have a particular position on issues and what we use to support these is also very important, right? We have to present the argument that is going to prove us right or wrong, or the other wrong, that there's been work that's being done, but this work does not really answer this question, does not really assist us to have an understanding of this. It does not really get us to a point where we can find a solution for a particular issue. So what I then come with is that other existing knowledge or literature or recommendations that are in place are actually insufficient, right? And that is why I'm going to come up with something that is going to assist us to further and understand. So how do you support your claims? By making sure that you have correct statistics, right? When you're saying there is the number the number of women maybe in management position continue to be lower in corporate environments, right? So you're making that claim that women who are in leadership in corporate environment continue to be much less, right? Lesser than men in these spaces. Okay, so that's a claim that you're making. On what basis are you making this claim? And then you can say the 2021 statistics on women in management in corporate environments in South Africa show us that only, I don't have the correct statistics, so I'm just going to make an example, that only 12% of management positions in corporate environments are occupied by women, right? So already then that makes your reader to think, oh, okay. So yeah, then there is an issue there if there's only 12%, right? And then you say, and a number of scholars have engaged with this issue. Some have focused on just women in management generally and showing how it continues to be a challenge. A study was done in maybe the academic environment, or a study was done in the public sector, looking at the number of women who are ministers, for example, right? So what are the sources? What are other points of reference that you have that are related to the work that you're doing that you can draw from and use as a way to support the claim that you're making? All right. And this is how you then build on the evidence. And so what are the basic parts of an argument? So it's the point of view. You've just said there's a low, the statistics show that there's a low number of women in management position, right? And here's another example again. So this is the statement that you believe, right? Women who are suffering from gender-based violence tend to be less productive at work and they are absent more. Okay, that's my point of view. That's the point that I'm putting forward. This is the argument that I'm making. And I'm saying this because gender-based violence negatively affects women's well-being, right? And if women are not well, either physically, psychologically, right, emotionally, then what's going to happen? They're not going to be in a good frame of mind or state for them to be productive. Right? And if they are not well, their well-being is compromised, chances are they might not go to work. Right? So and so this is the reason that I'm providing for the point of view that I've put forward. Right? And then, okay, fine, that's the claim that you're making. So what is the proof, again, what the evidence that backs up the claim that you're making, this point of view? And here, backing up your reason, this is where you provide the evidence that you can use to drive the point that you're making home, to make sure that your reader is on the same page as you. And here, then, the proof that you can provide in this particular case is that the World Health Organization has reported that gender-based violence results in lost wages. It results in increased health care costs and also mental health concerns. And so based on this evidence from World Health Organization, we can therefore see how women's well-being can be negatively impacted by gender-based violence, right? So you make a claim, but then you substantiate the claim. You make an argument and then you substantiate your argument, right? Women who are suffering from gender-based violence tend to be absent more. So this is now how you then turn that point of view into an argument. Women who are suffering from gender-based violence tend to be absent more and they're less productive at work. And based on this, we can therefore infer that gender-based violence negatively affects women's overall well-being and the economy, right? Because if people are absent at work, then it means work is not done. And if work is not done, then productivity is affected. And if productivity is affected, then the economy gets affected, right? So from the individual to the structural, right? From what happens at the personal level has got implications at the structural level. So with the argument that you're making, but focusing on women, so it's not only just a gender issue, but how this gender issue can move beyond just the individual, but also showing how the individual is not divorced, right, from the collective or the structural, and how all of these things are intertwined. So that's then the conclusion that you can then come to, right? But you can only come to the conclusion when you have shown me as your reader that this is indeed the case, right? So imagine if you're doing this work and you're making this argument, and when making this argument that women who suffer from gender-based violence tend to be absent and less productive, this you can also just make after maybe you've interviewed women, maybe who have had experiences with gender-based violence, and looking at some of the ways in which the violence has affected them. And then based on the results that you got and the interpretations that you make, the themes that come up or the issues that come up is that those women who are violated are unable to go to work. They say, because I was beaten up, because I was assaulted, because I was violated in these particular ways, I was unable to go to work. Or because I was assaulted and affected, even if it's not physically, but maybe emotionally, then you're not in a good state of mind to be able to do your work. So with that evidence, with the interviews maybe that you've conducted with the women, you can then say, based on this study, based on these interpretations that I've made from the data that I had, I'm therefore in a position to make a conclusion that gender-based violence has the potential to negatively affect women's overall well-being and the economy. And based on this, then you can make your recommendations and come to conclusions in terms of how do we then take this forward? What is it that needs to happen? What is it that needs to be put in place to be able to respond to what you have now brought to us, right? So the premise, the claim that supports your conclusion, because this is the conclusion that you're saying based on this, we can therefore infer, right? So you make an inference. And then you then provide the premise saying that given that World Health Organization has reported that gender-based violence results in lost wages, increased healthcare costs, and mental health concerns, we can therefore see how women's well-being and the economy can be negatively impacted by gender-based violence, right? So all the evidence that we have, all the evidence that's in place, assists us to be able to come to a conclusion and make the connection between a thriving economy and an economy that's negatively affected as a result of the impact of gender-based violence, right? And that's just one example, because we know there are many different ways in which gender-based violence affects families and societies and other sectors of society and the world, really. But again, how you're going to then focus this or zoom in is going to be dependent on what argument it is that you're making, right? You spoke about women being absent, you spoke about women being less productive. So that is going to be linked to the kind of conclusion that you come to. All right, but it also shows the focus, the specific, the specificity of your own work. Your work is specifically focusing on gender-based violence and how it manifests itself in these particular ways. And maybe you're someone who's in economic sciences and looking at it from an economic management perspective, right? So methods and techniques of argumentation. And here there's a few of them, right? So there's what is called the Dusoi logoi, twofold, also called twofold arguments. That's what that means. And this is based on a concept of opposing arguments. And again, the simple example that one can think of is for those of you who may be in the law faculty, this would be the kind of argumentation that maybe you might follow, right? Those who are in the legal field. So it's always about opposing arguments. So you think about how you're going to make your argument in a way that is not going to be easily refuted by the one who's on the opposing side, who is also going to make an argument. So why should we listen to your argument and not the other person's argument? Right? And that can only be determined by the kind of evidence that you bring forward. Okay, and this you also find in like debating spaces as well. So when you are debating, it's usually focused on a particular issue, but then you've got both sides. So is it right? Is it wrong? Or is it just dependent on who can convince us? And how do we get convinced? It's based on what it is that you put forward as the evidence. What is it that you put forward as things that are going to support the argument that you're making? All right. And then we have expeditio. And here it's about eliminating all the wrong items to come to a conclusion, right? And the example here would be when you're doing like experimental sciences, when you are in the medical science field, where you do tests, so you do experiments to be able to make a diagnosis. What is it that is causing this? How do we get to a point where we understand a particular ailment? When someone comes and they present with particular symptoms, and you want to be able to determine what is it that the person is suffering from, right? And what is it that they are presenting with, right? Is it just flu or is it COVID? So how do I know whether it's just flu or it's just COVID? So you're going to do tests that are going to assist you to be able to make that determination, right? Because you also don't want to misdiagnose. So here again, you're going to get to a point where you say, no, actually this is COVID. It's not flu. But you're saying it's COVID because these are the things that the person is presenting with, and this is how long it's been happening, and these are the signs that you're seeing. Again, here, you need to be able to provide the evidence of the kind of diagnosis that you're making, right? Is this person suffering from cancer, or are they not? Is it something else? So how do I get to a point where I make a determination that this is actually cancer or not? So if you are in the medical field and you're doing tests and experiments and you're still learning and you're right, you know the kinds of processes that are followed when you're thinking about doing tests. And those of us who are in the natural sciences, you think about conducting experiments that allow you and assist you to be able to understand and define a particular phenomena and get to particular results. So you do test upon test and upon test, and you look at the results until you get to a point where the results speak to the question that you put forward, or they speak to the hypothesis that you made. Or, of course, sometimes you do experiments over 3, 6, a long extended period of time, and you still are unable to maybe prove the hypothesis that you have, right? And then the last one is the Socratic dialogue, which is reaching a conclusion through answering questions. And this is what many of us would do, right? What is the argument? What is the question? Have all women been oppressed in the past? So it requires critical thinking. It requires reflective thinking. It requires independent mindedness. This is the claim that I'm making. This is the question that I have. But what questions are there that are going to assist me to be able to validate the argument that I have, right? And here's just an example of Socratic dialogue questions, right? What do you mean by all women have experienced some form of oppression in the past? What does that mean? What do you mean by that, right? And how does that relate to this? So how the kinds of questions that can be put forward that assist you to be able to engage and dig deep and find evidence so that you're able to answer and prove the claim that you have, right? So what is it that you're assuming, right? I'm assuming that all women have been oppressed. When you look at history, when you look at the past, this is my example. What could we assume instead? Is it possible that maybe some women and not all women, right? Is it possible that maybe we also need to look at the issue of race, right? Which racial groups? What if we looked at that? Could that then nullify the claim that you're making or not? You seem to be assuming that all women have similar or the same experiences, but we know there are very complicated history at play that might actually influence or contribute towards all women having been oppressed. And also, when you say all women have been oppressed, what kind of oppression are you talking about? And in what way did that oppression show itself, right? And those who follow like the feminist framework would also speak about issues like intersectionality, saying the experiences and the context also play a very important role, right? So you seem to be assuming this. So can you really assume that all women, and you bracket them all in the same basket? Is it a claim that you can really support, right? How would you justify taking this for granted? The very fact that, you know, we've got colonialism, we've got apartheid, and all of those things played a critical role in how women navigate the world, how women engage with the world, how women understand, feel, and experience oppression, right? And is it always the case, or was it always the case that women experienced oppression? So these are the kinds of questions that would propel you to really think deeply about the kind of argument that you're making, and being able to say, but can I validate this argument or not? So this is what Socratic dialogue questions do, and allow you or assist you to be able to make a very strong argument. So if I'm making this argument, can, through answering this question, still then say, this is the argument that I want to make, right? I hope that's clear. Okay, I'm almost done. Types of arguments. The classical one where you present the main argument. I spoke about this earlier, where I was talking about the tools for thinking about divided attention in children. So present the main argument, state your opinion, and then do your best to convince the reader why your stance is the right one. This is also called Aristotelian. This is the most popular strategy for making an argument because it's the most simple line of thinking to follow. It's effective when your audience doesn't have a lot of information or a strong opinion about your topic, right? But of course, you know, within academic spaces, you know, I would hope that your supervisor does have a lot of information or some information about the topic that you're coming in so that they're able to guide you, right? But at the same time, putting an argument forward, stating your opinion, assist you to also outline the facts clearly and concisely when you've done that. And then the Rogerian one is presenting the problem. This is the problem that I'm putting forward. There are others who've looked at this problem, but looked at it maybe in other different ways. It exists, they're there, I acknowledge that. And then, but this is how I'm coming into the conversation. You state your point of view and explain why it's important for us to give attention to that particular focus, right? Is the most beneficial to the reader, why your point of view or your argument is important. This type of argument is effective for popularizing topics as it acknowledges both sides and present the middle ground, right? And then Tolman, you present your claim, present grounds to back up that claim, and then justify the grounds that are linked to that claim. Okay. And then this is just a summarized version. I won't waste time on it. Again, it's about the premises, illustrating your main points, right? This would act as the main topic for each of your paragraph. I've discussed that already. And then how do you then move from there? You gather evidence that will validate these premises. So your sources, your literature, the data that you collect. Evidence can be hard facts, statements, as I said, because it validates what you claim. acknowledging other arguments, and if they need to refute or add on them, also doing that. All right. So when you're actually doing this, when you're writing this, always have your reader in mind. Guide your reader through your argument in a logical way. Think about what questions your reader might have, and this is very important, right? Would you be able to answer questions that may be posed to you based on the claim that you're making? So again, think about possible questions that might be asked and answer those questions before they are asked, right? So for example, now when you're writing your thesis or your dissertation, and for those who are still in the proposal phase, also same in terms of why this topic is important, why you're proposing this topic, is that you must also think about the committee that's going to be examining your work. You need to think about the examiners that are going to be examining your work. As you're doing this work, you have your supervisor next to you, and the supervisor is there to read your draft and ask you questions that maybe you might not have thought about, and assist you to answer some of the questions that arise as a result of the argument that you're making. But when it goes out to the examiner, you're not going to have the chance in that moment to be able to answer questions that may arise. And that's why it's important for you to make sure that through the way in which you put your arguments across, the claims across, that you support those claims, that you answer the questions that the examiner might have. Because if an examiner has to ask themselves a question based on what they're reading in your work and then able to get an answer in what you've presented to them, then that's going to leave your work wanting, okay? And we don't want that. All right. Present both sides of the debate. As we've said, even when you draw from your literature, don't just draw from the literature that's in line with what you're saying. Put, authors and sources in conversation with each other, enter that conversation as well. And then you work towards a conclusion, and that you can get to after you've done all these things, right? Here's the evidence. Here are ideas and issues accepted or rejected. Your conclusion should make clear where you stand, right? So where do you stand? What is it that you're saying? Are you saying that gender violence is really an issue when we're thinking about the troubled economy that we have? And if we don't do anything about the scourge of gender violence in a country such as South Africa, then we should not expect that the economic crisis or economic challenges that we have will go away anytime soon, right? So that could be a conclusion, right? So it's a statement that you're making at the end, that this is what I want to leave you, the reader, with, to think about, to act upon, right? All right, so this is just types of argument claims, the facts, the policy, a definition in terms of what you're arguing about, the value of the argument that you're making, and then the cause and the effect, right? What causes the problem of gender-based violence, and what effect does it have, and how can we respond to that? And that can come across through how your arguments are being put forward in your work. All right. Yeah, and here's just example in conclusion. Thesis statement. I'd already given an example of one. So there you see there's the thesis statement, right? And then in the middle, you have a summary of the main ideas within the paper, right? Within this paragraph, in this case, right? So each and every paragraph, you start with the opening statement, the thesis statement, and then you have the ideas that then engage with the thesis statement, that support it, that speak to it. And then at the end, you also then provide the significance of that argument that you're making, all right? And this is also just another example as well in that line. Okay, so how do you start, right? So interesting ways in which you can start your work also. Okay, and I think I will stop here and then stop sharing so that we can go back to the question and answer. I wanted to say to having a conversation, but it's a conversation, but in a different format, isn't it? Okay, I see there isn't a lot of questions. Is the topic the same as the thesis? The thesis is what your work is about. So the topic is very specific. It's a broad, specific. My apologies. The topic is the broad idea of what your work is going to be focusing on. And then based on this topic, you then going to formulate a thesis statement, right? I'm trying to think of an example. So maybe your topic is experiences of women experiences of women who I'm struggling to think of an example now. But yeah, when you think about your research topic, just think about your own research topic, right? So you have the topic, and then this topic will then assist you, or based on this topic, you then come with a statement, a thesis statement, right? And the thesis is the broad focus of your work, right? Is the broad focus that assist you to then be able to have an argument for the work that you're doing, right? Okay, so how we come to exist and how we come to produce knowledge, and how we come to engage with that knowledge, are all important points and important parts of how we then come to formulating a particular argument, right? And the argument is linked to how knowledge is produced, right? So how we come to be, how we come to understand the world, right? Ontology, and the epistemology, also how we come to know, how we produce knowledge, how we create meaning in the world. So all those issues, right, feature in the argument, in that through your argument, you're going to engage with the ways in which we should be looking at the world, in the ways in which we should be understanding the world. And you do that, and you then do the work to convince us so that we can be able to see and understand why it's important for us to think about reality in those ways, right? You put forward an argument so that we can be able to think about how we produce knowledge, right? And how knowledge comes to be produced. So I guess the main argument is an integral part of the ways in which we think about how knowledge is produced, but also how we think about how meaning is made in the world and how we come into that world, right? I hope I'm making sense, right? And how do you integrate them? I think you integrate them in how you then follow on in the ways in which you prove, you provide evidence for the claim that you have made, right? And that then drives you and speak to how knowledge becomes produced. And it also speaks to what is it that you draw from as sources that assist you to be able to provide evidence for the claims that you're making, right? So how do we come to know, right? How do we come to make meaning of the experiences of women who've experienced gender-based violence, right? We come to this by trying to look at how do we understand gender-based violence? How do we understand how women experience this violence? And how do we think about the processes that need to be put in place for us to be able to respond to this violence, right? So are we going to zoom in and think about it from a neoliberal capitalist perspective, for example, and just thinking about, oh, when women are absent at work, it really affects productivity, and when women are not here, it's a problem because we can't make money, right? And if we can't make money, then we're not going to be successful, right? And so let's try and put some processes in place so that women are able to come to work. So you can come to work, and we'll make sure that there are offices that deal with people who've suffered from GBV, or there's some support spaces for you at work, but you have to come to work, right? Because productivity is important. These are the ways that we're going to support you, right? So it's very unidirectional in terms of how the responses come about. And this is where I think your philosophies as a researcher, in terms of how you come into the work that you're doing, you respond to the challenges that are put forward for you, determine how you then think about the role of epistemology, for example. Right. So if you're coming at it, let's say, from a decolonial perspective or a decolonial feminist perspective, then you look at the issue more broadly, going beyond just the ways in which gender-based violence is linked to just the economy. So even if you're not saying that the economy is not important, right? Because it is for the survival and our sustenance and all that. But you're saying it should not be the determining factor and an integral issue in terms of how we think about women and well-being, right? So what is it that you are centering? And when you've decided on what it is that you are centering, then that is going to determine the steps that you're going to follow when you provide evidence for the argument that you're making, right? I hope that makes sense. So this idea, or the question on where and how do you integrate them, it's in the actual doing of the work. It's in the kinds of decisions that you make as a researcher, in terms of the steps that you're going to follow to provide evidence for the claim that you've made. So those steps that you're going to follow are going to then determine the kind of epistemological lens and overview and framework that you come with as a researcher. The ways in which you understand meaning and existence and well-being, all of those will play an integral part and be central in how you're then going to integrate and maneuver and provide the evidence for your work. All right. Is the claim same as an assumption? Yes, right. They are the same. So you make a particular claim in a study, or you make a particular assumption. So this is the assumption that I'm making, that when women are abused, then productivity will be affected because women are going to be absent, right? So that's the assumption. And then you then work on towards engaging with that assumption and providing proof for us that that is indeed the case. And that is what a claim does as well. So they can be used interchangeably. All right. Is it acceptable to have supporting arguments of the thesis statement in 2 paragraphs? Yes, yes, yes. Of course, you may do that. Remember, I said that it should not be too long, though. You need to be able to state your thesis, and then be very deliberate and in terms of what is it that you're going to draw on to support the arguments that you're making. But yes, it is acceptable that you can have your supporting statements in 2 paragraphs. That is more than acceptable. Okay, because maybe you have a number of sources that you want to draw from that maybe speak to each other, that maybe you want to put in conversation with each other, and you feel that doing so is going to assist you to be able to support the argument that you're making. That is more than acceptable. All right. Okay. I'm not seeing any more questions, and I hope everybody is on the same page as me, and I hope the points that were made on the importance of thinking seriously about the arguments that you're making, the claims that you're making, came across in a way that was understandable for you. Because remember, when you're writing a thesis, at the end of the day, it all depends on the kinds of argument that you're making. It all depends on the flow in terms of how you move from one point to another. So you might have very rich data, or you might have good information that is there, but if it is not clear to your reader what kind of argument you're trying to make, then it becomes easy for one to get lost, right? There's a colleague who was saying sometimes it takes quite a long time for you to really formulate an argument, because an argument will be very instrumental. And when you have a good formulated argument, then what follows, right? What follows becomes so much easier, because from that argument, then you can be able to connect with many other things. Think of reading a book. You're reading a narrative, and there's a story. And a story has got a beginning, and a story has got an end, a story has got a middle. And what we define as a good book is one that has got a narrative that flows. And if you have a narrative, but your narrative does not flow, then your reader gets lost. And if your reader gets lost, then it becomes difficult for that reader to then think positively about the work that you've produced. Sometimes you produce 50 pages or you produce 100 pages, but it's not clear what it is that you're saying, right? You know, like when you come up with a topic and we say, why should we care? Why is it important that this topic should be investigated, that there should be research that focuses on this topic. Because remember, not all the topic that comes forward, all the research that are suggested are worth researching in a way that you have put forward. So again, it's not because the topic is not important, it's not because the topic is not worthy of being investigated, but it's in the way that you have presented it. And that sometimes closes the door for you, right? And that sometimes means you not being able to get a supervisor that's willing to supervise you because of the lack of articulation in the ways in which you are suggesting an issue and saying this is why it's important for us to investigate this issue, right? And remember, you also still need to convince your examiner. I know I'm speaking to you and you're already in the system, which means you already have supervisors, you're already working on this research, but going forward, you still have examiners to contend with. So as you're doing the work, it's always very important to say, is there a logical flow, right? And that's at the heart of academic writing. And academic writing is about not only the flow, but also about the arguments that you're making and how these arguments are assisting us to make sense of the point that you've put on the table. Right? I hope that makes sense. And I think maybe just because I don't want to risk repeating myself, I'm going to stop here. And I see there are no more questions. And I think in the absence of any more questions, I can then say thank you very much. Thank you very much for attending this session. And please enjoy the rest of your evening and all the best for those of you who are working on your proposals as you are hopefully at a point where you're finalizing your proposals. All the best with that. And those who are busy with your chapters, I hope that all is going well. Okay, everyone, goodbye. Hope to see you in the next session. Bye.